Welcome to True Crime Cases today. We are unveiling a shocking story of jealousy and violence. Julia was living a seemingly perfect life. She had a successful career, a beautiful home, and a marriage that had lasted over a decade. Her husband Carson was charming and attentive, and they shared a bond that Julia believed was unbreakable. To maintain her health and relieve stress, she had recently hired a personal trainer named Alora, who quickly became a trusted confidant. One evening after a grueling day at work, Julia decided to surprise Carson by coming home early. She had planned a romantic evening for the two of them, complete with a homemade dinner and his favorite wine. As she entered their spacious home, she noticed something unusual. The house was eerily quiet, and Carson's car was in the driveway. Curious, Julia quietly made her way upstairs, hoping to find Carson resting. However, as she approached their bedroom, she heard soft laughter and whispered words. The door was slightly ajar, and what she saw next shattered her world. Then on their bed were Carson and Alora locked in an intimate embrace. Julia's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the betrayal unfold. The sight of her husband with her personal trainer, a woman she had trusted, left her feeling numb with shock and anger. She stepped back, careful not to make a sound, and quietly left the house, her mind racing with thoughts of revenge. For the next few days, Julia was a ghost in her own home. She avoided Carson, who was oblivious to the fact that she had discovered his affair. The betrayal ate away at her, turning her love into a seething rage. The image of Carson and Alora together was burned into her mind, and it fueled her desire for revenge. Julia began to craft a plan. She knew that confronting Carson directly wouldn't satisfy the deep anger she felt. Instead, she wanted him to experience the same pain and humiliation that she had endured. She needed to be smart, calculating, and patient to everyone around her. Julia appeared to be her usual self, calm, composed, and loving. She continued her sessions with Alora, pretending nothing was amiss, even as she secretly observed the trainer's every move. Alora was blissfully unaware of Julia's knowledge, continuing her affair with Carson without suspicion. Julia's plan began to take shape, and it would be as intricate and devastating as the betrayal itself. She would destroy their lives piece by piece until they were left with nothing. Julia's first move was subtle. She started by planting seeds of doubt in Alora's mind. During their training sessions, Julia would casually mention how Carson seemed distant lately, or how he was spending more time away from home. She carefully crafted her words to make it seem as though she was simply confiding in a friend, but in reality, she was playing on Alora's insecurities. Alora, who had begun to believe that Carson was serious about their relationship, started to feel uneasy. Julia's words made her question Carson's commitment to her, and she began to probe him with questions about his feelings and their future together. At the same time, Julia began distancing herself from Carson. She no longer greeted him with a kiss when he came home, and she made excuses to avoid spending time with him. Carson, who was caught up in his affair, didn't immediately notice the change, but Julia knew it was only a matter of time before he did. As Carson and Alora's relationship became strained, Julia prepared for her next move. She needed to create a situation where they would turn on each other, where their relationship would implode without her having to lift a finger. With Alora's trust beginning to waver, Julia decided it was time to escalate her plan. She knew that Alora was vulnerable, so she began dropping hints about Carson's supposed infidelity with other women. Julia fabricated stories of how Carson had been seen with different women around town, making it seem like he was a serial cheater. Alora, already feeling insecure, became increasingly paranoid. She started confronting Carson more frequently, accusing him of seeing other women. Carson, bewildered by her sudden change in behavior, denied the accusations, but the seeds of doubt had already been planted. Meanwhile, Julia began collecting evidence of the affair. She secretly recorded conversations between Carson and Alora, took photos of their clandestine meetings, and even managed to get hold of some of their private messages. Julia's meticulous nature ensured that she had everything she needed to expose their betrayal when the time was right. The tension between Carson and Alora grew with each passing day, and their once passionate affair began to crumble. Julia watched with satisfaction as they started to fight and argue over trivial matters. The time was nearing when she would strike, and she needed to ensure that her revenge would be as devastating as possible. One evening, as Carson and Alora sat together in a secluded restaurant, Julia made her move. She had already arranged for a package to be delivered to Alora's apartment that contained all the evidence she had gathered: the photo, the recordings, the messages, everything that would prove Carson's infidelity, not just with Alora, but with other women as well. Alora received the package later that night, and as she opened it, her world came crashing down. The realization that Carson had been deceiving her as well. As Julia sent her into a spiral of rage and despair, she confronted Carson, immediately showing him the evidence and demanding an explanation. Carson, caught off guard, tried to deny it at first, but the overwhelming proof left him with no choice but to admit his wrongdoings. Alora, furious and heartbroken, accused him of using her, of making her a fool. The two argued violently, and in a fit of anger, Alora ended their relationship, storming out of the apartment. Julia, who had been monitoring the situation from afar, felt a grim satisfaction as she watched her plan unfold. She knew that this was just the beginning. Alora had been hurt, but Carson's punishment was far from over with. Alora out of the picture, Julia turned her full attention to Carson. She knew that he was vulnerable now, having lost both his lover and his wife's affection. Carson had started to notice Julia's coldness toward him, and he became increasingly desperate to mend their relationship. Julia played the role of the betrayed wife perfectly. She pretended to be devastated by the sudden distance in their marriage, crying and blaming herself for their problems. Carson, racked with guilt, tried to comfort her, not realizing that he was falling deeper into her traps. Julia began manipulating Carson's emotions, making him believe that the only way to save their marriage was to confess everything and start anew. She convinced him to write a letter confessing his infidelity and begging for her forgiveness, which she secretly kept as part of her plan. As Carson became more emotionally dependent on her, Julia started isolating him from his friends and family, subtly pushing them away until Carson felt completely alone. He became increasingly paranoid, questioning everything and everyone around him. Julia's psychological manipulation was working perfectly, and Carson was on the verge of a breakdown. One night, Julia decided it was time for the next phase of her plan. She confronted Carson with the evidence of his affair with Alora, presenting him with the letter he had written as well as the photos and recording she had collected. Carson was stunned, realizing that Julia had known about the affair all along. Julia's cold, calculating demeanor sent chills down his spine. She told him that she had forgiven him, but that their marriage would never be the same. She also informed him that she had no intention of leaving him. That would be too easy. Instead, she wanted him to suffer as she had to live every day with the guilt and shame of what he had done. Carson, broken and humiliated, begged for her forgiveness, but Julia remained unmoved. she made it clear that she had no intention of ever trusting him again, and that their marriage would now be nothing more than a facade. As Carson realized the extent of Julia's control over him, he began to spiral into depression. He lost interest in his work, his friends, and even his own well-being. Julia's revenge was taking its toll, but she wasn't finished yet. Carson's mental state continued to deteriorate. He became paranoid, convinced that Julia was watching his every move. He started to see shadows where there were none, hearing whispers that weren't there. Julia's manipulation had driven him to the brink of madness, and she reveled in his suffering. Meanwhile, Julia began to plant evidence that would make it seem like Carson was losing his grip on reality. She would move objects around the house, erase messages from his phone, and even leave threatening notes that appeared to be from Alora. Carson, already paranoid, began to believe that Alora was stalking him, seeking revenge for their breakup. Julia's plan was working perfectly. Carson's colleagues noticed his erratic behavior, and soon rumors began to spread that he was unfit for his job. Carson, once a respected businessman, was now seen as a man on the edge of a breakdown. His reputation was crumbling, just as Julia had intended. As Carson's paranoia deepened, he started to suspect everyone around him, including Julia. He became convinced that she was in cahoots with Alora, that they were both out to destroy him. But Julia played her role flawlessly, pretending to be the concerned wife while secretly driving him further into madness. As Carson's world continued to crumble, Julia took the next step in her plan. She began to manipulate the people around Carson, turning them against him one by one. She subtly suggested to his friends and colleagues that Carson was unstable, that he was prone to violent outbursts and irrational behavior. Soon Carson found himself isolated with no one to turn to. His friends stopped returning his calls, his colleagues avoided him, and even his family began to distance themselves. Carson was left alone, trapped in a nightmare of his own making, with only Julia by his side. Julia's manipulation extended to their finances as well. She quietly drained their joint accounts, leaving Carson with nothing. When he finally discovered what she had done, it was too late. Julia had already transferred the money to accounts in her name, leaving him penniless. Carson's desperation reached new heights. He tried to confront Julia, but she remained calm, accusing him of being delusional and irrational. She threatened to have him committed if he didn't calm down, and Carson, terrified of being locked away, backed down. Julia's control over Carson was now complete. He was a shell of the man he once was, broken and defeated, with nowhere to turn. But Julia's thirst for revenge was still not satisfied. Julia knew that Carson was teetering on the edge, and she decided it was time to deliver the final blow. She began to plant evidence that would suggest Carson was planning to harm her. She staged scenes in their home that made it look like Carson had been violent, leaving bruises on her arms and scratches on her face. She also began to keep a detailed journal documenting Carson's supposed threats and erratic behavior. She made sure to share her concerns with close friends and family, painting herself as the victim of an abusive husband. As the evidence mounted, Julia knew that it was only a matter of time before someone intervened. She even went so far as to file a restraining order against Carson, claiming that she feared for her life. Carson, too, broke in to fight back. I accepted the STS without protest. The restraining order was the final nail in the coffin. Carson was forced to leave their home, moving into a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. He had lost everything: his wife, his reputation, his money, and now he was completely alone. Carson's descent into despair was a slow, agonizing process. The once confident businessman had become a shadow of his former self spending his days in the dim, musty confines of the rundown motel he now called home. The flickering neon sign outside his window cast an eerie glow over the room, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. He barely ate, surviving on a diet of cheap whiskey and stale takeout, his body wasting away as his mind spiraled into darkness each day, blended into the next Carson only by the relentless barrage of tormenting thoughts that haunted him. Julia's betrayal played on a continuous loop in his mind, mingling with the guilt and shame of his own actions. The effect air, once a source of excitement, had become the catalyst for his undoing, and he was drowning in the consequences. Carson couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains sent his heart racing. He imagined Alora lurking in the shadows, her eyes filled with hatred, waiting for the perfect moment to exact her revenge. The paranoia noted him eroding what little sanity he had left. His sleep was plagued by nightmares. In his dreams, he was trapped in a dark, endless maze, pursued by a faceless figure that whispered accusations in his ear. No matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape the voice. And when he finally turned to confront it, he was met with the cold, accusing eyes of both Alora and Julia. He would wake in a cold sweat, gasping for breath, only to find himself alone in the suffocating darkness of his motel room. The anonymous letters Julia sent were the final nails in his coffin. Each one was carefully crafted to deepen his paranoia and push him closer to the edge. They arrived in plain envelopes, slipped under his door in the dead of night. At first, they were subtle, vague hints and taunts that could be dismissed as harmless pranks, but as the days passed, they grew more sinister. One letter, written in a shaky hand, read, "I see you, Carson. I know what you did. You can't hide forever." Another taunted him with the words, "Alora isn't done with you. She's just getting started." Each time he read one, Carson's fear intensified. He began to suspect everyone around him, every stranger in the street, every passerby. He started to believe that Alora was everywhere, watching him, waiting for her moment to strike. His paranoia drove him to irrational acts. He covered the windows of his motel room with blankets, convinced that Alora was spying on him. Through the thin, threadbare curtains, he unplugged the phone, fearing that she might how trace his calls. He even considered leaving town, disappearing without a trace. But the thought of abandoning everything he had ever known terrified him more than the idea of facing Alora. In his drunken stupor, Carson would sometimes talk to himself, muttering incoherent words of guilt and fear. He would pace the room, clutching a bottle of whiskey as if it were his only lifeline, trying to make sense of the chaos that had consumed his life. But there were no answers, only the deafening silence of his isolation. One particularly bad night, after downing half a bottle of whiskey, Carson found himself staring at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. The man who stared back at him was a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, and defeated. Vibrant man he once was had been replaced by this broken shell, a victim of his own making. He couldn't look away from those eyes filled with a mix of fear, regret, and something darker, something he could no longer control. "Why did you do it?" he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "Why did you throw it all away?" The reflection offered no answers, only a silent mockery of the man he had become. Carson smashed the bottle against the sink in a fit of rage, shards of glass flying everywhere, but the anger quickly dissolved into a flood of tears. He sank to the floor, his body racked with sobs, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of his despair. As the night wore on, Carson's thoughts grew darker. He began to consider the unthinkable, an escape from the pain that seemed never ending. The idea of ending it all began to take root in his mind offering a twisted form of solace. Death seemed like the only way to silence the voices, to escape the relentless guilt that gnawed at his soul. But there was one loose end that Carson couldn't ignore. Alora. The letters had convinced him that she was the one behind his torment, that she was the reason his life had unraveled so completely. He became obsessed with the idea that confronting her would somehow give him closure, that it would end nightmare once and for all. In his twisted logic, Carson convinced himself that Alora had to pay for what she had done. She was the reason he had lost everything: his wife, his reputation, his sanity. If he could just confront her, make her understand the hell she had put him through, maybe then he could find some peace. Fueled by alcohol and madness, Carson made his decision. He would find Alora, confront her, and make her pay. It was the only way to end the torment, only way to reclaim some semblance of control over his shattered life. With a resolve born out of desperation, Carson left the motel, his steps unsteady but determined. The night was cold and unforgiving, the streets deserted. As he made his way toward Alora's apartment, his mind was a blur of conflicting emotions: rage, fear, and a twisted sense of justice. As he approached her building, Carson's heart pounded in his chest. The alcohol had dulled his senses, but the fear remained gnawing at him with every step. He climbed the stairs to her apartment, each one feeling like a step closer to the abyss. When he reached her door, he paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. For a moment, he hesitated. A small voice in the back of his mind urging him to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But the madness had taken hold, and there was no turning back. Now, with a deep breath, Carson pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness of Alora's apartment. The confrontation that followed would be the final act in the tragic play that Carson's life had become, a moment where all the pain, guilt, and paranoia converged in a deadly climax. Alora, who had not seen Carson since their breakup, was shocked to find him at her doorstep. She tried to calm him down, but Carson was beyond reason. He accused her of ruining his life, of plotting against him with Julia, and of driving him to the brink of madness. The confrontation quickly turned violent. Carson, in his fury, lashed out at Alora, and in the ensuing struggle, he accidentally killed her. The reality of what he had done hit him like a freight train, and for a moment he was paralyzed. With shock, panicking, Carson fled the scene, leaving Alora's lifeless body behind. He drove aimlessly through the night, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had done. He knew there was no going back now. He had crossed a line, and his life was truly over. Carson's flight from the scene didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors heard the commotion and called the police, who quickly discovered Alora's body. An investigation was launched, and it didn't take long for the authorities to link Carson to the crime. Carson, now a fugitive, knew that it was only a matter of time before the police caught up with him. Desperate and out of options, he decided to end it all on his own terms. He returned to the place where his life had begun to unravel. His home. Julia was there, waiting for him. She had anticipated his return and had prepared for this final confrontation. As Carson stumbled into the house, she greeted him with a cold smile. Knowing that she had won in his final moments, Carson realized the full extent of Julia's betrayal. She had orchestrated everything: his downfall, his isolation, even Alora's death. It was all part of her twisted plan for revenge. Carson, broken and defeated, saw no other